Oh, I think he's gone to work, hasn't he?
No, he's in the other meeting that you just opened and left.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm recording this one. So anyway, we've got more or less everybody here. Right. Anyway, so let's see if we can get this going again. Otherwise, it's going to be bedtime before too long.
That's the right one.
Right. Okay. We got as far as photosynthesis. Right.
Oh yeah, the snazzy bit.
So can we all, Sky, can you see it now?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Right. Okay. So look, very simply, photosynthesis, what photosynthesis does is take light energy from the sun and turn it into chemical energy in glucose. That's the whole point of it, because you can't store light energy, but you can store chemical energy, and then it can be used for the cell's functions, whatever they need to do. Okay, so chemosynthesis, you probably don't know a lot about. Where are those two things?
Underwater.
Yeah. So what are they?
Volcanoes under the sea.
Well, effectively, they're very similar to that. They're deep sea vents. So at the bottom, deep down in the ocean, they're basically where the tectonic plates are moving apart, and that allows water to seep down into the mantle, where it gets heated, and then that causes it to come out again. And it also, because there's lots of minerals dissolved in the water as well, the certain bacteria and archaea can chemically extract energy from those. So one way they do it is by oxidizing hydrogen sulfide. You do not need to know that equation in any form, okay? But it's just showing, so there is chemical energy in the hydrogen sulfide, and they convert that into methanol, which is basically a carbohydrate in the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in the ratio of H2O. So there are other bacteria, other archaea, and viruses as well, which down there, and they use all sorts of things. So methane, hydrogen, and even some metals like iron, which has got different oxidation states to actually get energy out. Okay, so we're not, chemosynthesis doesn't even really come into A level, but I think it's something, just to make you aware that photosynthesis is not the only type of producers that we have. Right, I want to talk about something called primary productivity, and this is something which every year causes people a bit of difficulty, and I don't think it should, because it's essentially quite simple. You've got two ecosystems there. You've got a tundra on the left and a rainforest on the right. So primary productivity is the rate at which energy is incorporated into an ecosystem. In other words, the rate at which the producers are turning light energy into chemical energy. So it's measured in energy per unit time and per unit area. So you've got to obviously take account of the area. So generally you'd use meters squared, but you could conceivably talk about kilometers squared. And the time period is generally a year. Why would you use a year rather than a month or a day? To measure the amount of energy being taken in.
Different seasons.
Yeah, exactly. So certainly in higher latitudes, the amount of productivity in the summer in this country is much greater than in the winter. So you might get units such as joules per meter squared per year. Okay, but you could have other measurements of area and time. This is important because the primary productivity dictates how many producers and consumers can then survive in that ecosystem, because all the other consumers are feeding off that primary productivity. Mm-hmm. So in the rainforest, the rainforest can support far more consumers and much bigger food webs because the primary productivity is much greater. In the tundra, there are very few animals because the productivity is much lower. and it's mainly things like lichens, as we talked about previously. I know you've just done stuff on biodiversity, haven't you, with Mrs. Taylor? So how do you think primary productivity would relate to biodiversity?
Is it a higher biodiversity the higher the primary productivity?
Yeah,
Or like
in general, that's true. The greater primary productivity usually means greater biodiversity, because you're creating more, greater variety of food, greater variety of shelter, so it creates more niches, so lots of different consumers can exist. However, there is an exception to that, which is what this picture shows. If you get a lake which is eutrophic, so high nutrient levels because fertilizers have run off into it, that will cause an increase in the diversity of the algae that grow, but the effect of that then is to soak up all the oxygen, and you might end up with lower diversity as a result. Okay, so generally greater, but there are exceptions. Okay, so I want to just start with an overview of photosynthesis. I think in year 13 there were 3 quite big topics. One is photosynthesis, which people find tough. One is photosynthesis, one is respiration, and the other is the immune system. So I'm going to take a bit of time on photosynthesis, and hopefully it's not too repetitive. At GCSE, you would have come across that equation. Carbon dioxide and water is turned into glucose and oxygen, and that requires light energy, and it also requires chlorophyll, because chlorophyll is the chemical that actually absorbs the light energy. Overall, photosynthesis is endothermic. We know what that means. That means that there is more energy in the products than the reactants. That's obviously why we need light energy to be input. So most of that energy is locked up in the glucose. There's more energy in glucose than there was in the carbon dioxide and water. So endothermic reaction. And if we reverse it, it's an exothermic reaction, which is aerobic respiration. And you know that when you respire a lot aerobically, you get hot, and that's because it's an exothermic reaction. All right, so not broadly, but the photosynthesis happens in 2 stages, and we're going to look at each of these in a lot of detail. The first one is called the light dependent reaction, which tells you exactly what it is. That's the bit that involves light. And the energy from light is used to split water molecules, and that's called photolysis or photolysis. Okay, photolight, lysis means splitting. So that light energy is used to split water. The oxygen atoms from water then are no longer used. So the first part of the reaction involves only water, not carbon dioxide, and energy is used to split the water molecule. The oxygen atoms are then thrown away. The hydrogen from the water is used in the second part of the reaction, which is called the light independent reaction. And in that, the hydrogen atoms, and you will recall again from your chemistry, a hydrogen atom is 1 proton and 1 electron. And we're going to be talking a lot about electrons in this. So they react with carbon dioxide to make carbohydrate. So CO2 plus hydrogen makes CH2O. That's the what's it called? What's it called? The simplest formula of a compound. Chemists, come on.
Empirical?
Empirical, thank you. Well done. Couldn't think of the word. Yeah, so CH2O is the empirical formula of glucose. So if you multiply it by 6, you get C6H12O6. And so that comes from all the carbon comes from carbon dioxide, and all the hydrogen comes from water. Right, there's a little animation here just to try and help you remember this. So you've got the two reactions there, the light dependent reaction on the left, light independent on the right. We've got two molecules of water. So first thing that happens along, we get some light, and the light is splitting the water molecules and separating the oxygen. So the oxygen then is given off as a waste product and disappears. We then have these two molecules called NADP. And what NADP does is carry, it's a hydrogen carrier. So the NADP picks up hydrogens and then it takes them across to the light independent reaction. And then so that just like little shuttles, they go backwards and forwards, picking up oxygen and taking it from one to the other. The other thing we need is energy. And the light energy, we've already used that, but what happens is that gets turned into ATP. So light energy hits chlorophyll. Again, we'll look at this in more detail next time, but that is transferred to energy in electrons, and that is then turned into energy in ATP. And the ATP molecules can then shuttle across to where the light independent reaction happens. What then happens, the water is given off, a molecule of water is given off there, and what's left is our empirical formula for carbohydrate, HCOH. And again, if we have 6 multiples of that, we can then make a glucose molecule. Okay, so key things to remember from this, the two reactions, light dependent and light independent. The light independent only uses water. There's no CO2 in the light dependent, and there's no water in the light independent. Okay, so one of those two reactants is involved in only one of the reactions. Okay, now the other thing, they like to ask lots of questions about oxidation and reduction. And again, GCSE, oil rig, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain, and that refers to electrons. So because we're moving electrons around, there are lots of oxidation and reduction reactions. So as I said, hydrogen is simply one proton and one electron. So if you add electrons or hydrogen atoms, you are reducing something. And you've just seen that we added hydrogen to the CO2. So the CO2 is being reduced to form carbohydrate by the addition of hydrogen. Okay, is everybody happy with that? Any questions? Then I've got some questions for you. So I want some answers, please. Which molecule provides the source of hydrogen?
Water.
What is the water? Right. So the hydrogen came from water in the light dependent reaction. Tough one, this. What's the source of energy?
Sun.
Light. Yeah. And that's again via electrons. When we look at that in more detail, it's turned into ATP. ATP is what cells use. And which molecule provides? Oh, that's the that should say that's wrong actually. Which molecule provides the carbon for the light independent reaction?
Carbon dioxide.
Oh, sorry, no, I've got that wrong. Okay, so it's a bad question. Yeah, you're right, carbon dioxide. But the question's saying how does hydrogen get to the independent reaction? It's carried there by reduced NADP. I'll talk about that. And which molecule provides the energy for the reduction of carbon dioxide? What molecule carries the energy from one to the other? 3 letters.
ATP.
ATP.
Right, good. Okay. So again, this is a bit of a summary again. So we've got water being split into 3 things: hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen. The oxygen's given off. The electrons actually provide the energy to build up ATP. Our carrier molecule, NADP, picks up the electrons and the hydrogen, and that then becomes reduced NADP because it's gained electrons and it's gained hydrogen ions. Okay, so it kind of shuttles between NADP and reduced NADP. CO2 and the NADP provides the hydrogen ions and the electrons for the light independent reaction. The CO2 diffuses in as well, and the energy, the hydrogen, the electrons and the carbon dioxide all go together to make glucose. Okay, now that's not, don't worry about balancing things here. This is not a balanced equation, but those are the general principles. If you can remember that, you can answer most of the questions you'll get in photosynthesis. Right, so the other thing I just wanted to cover now is about ADP and ATP. So understand how phosphorylation of ADP requires energy and that hydrolysis of ATP provides an immediate supply of energy for biological processes. What does phosphorylation mean?
No idea.
Well, what molecule is it?
Addition of a phosphate.
Yes, correct. Right. So you're adding a phosphate group to something. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. It's got 3 phosphates. ADP has got 2 phosphates. So when you turn ADP into ATP, you are phosphorylating it. Right, ATP then. ATP is the means by which a cell uses energy, and it carries energy around the cell. We'll come across this as well in respiration. So when respiration goes on in the mitochondria, you build up ATP in the mitochondria. They then travel to other parts of the cell and give that energy to whatever it's needed for. ATP never leaves a cell. It never carries it around the body. If we want to carry energy around the body, we'd use things like glucose or fatty acids. You will notice if you look at the diagram, it's a nucleotide. It's got a sugar, which is ribose. It's got a nitrogenous base, adenine. And in fact, if it only had one phosphate group, that would be exactly the same as the nucleotide, which is present in RNA, the A nucleotide. So it's the ribose sugar, the phosphate, which make the backbone, and then you've got the adenine base. So this is the only difference is that ATP has got 2 more phosphate groups added. And the most important one is the 3rd phosphate, which has fairly weak bonds, and therefore it can be removed to make ADP, and it can be re-added. When you take off the 3rd phosphate group, phosphates bond very strongly with water, and making bonds releases energy, exothermic. So that's how ATP releases energy for use. ATP becomes ADP and energy given out. You won't be asked about bonding with water, but it's just to try and understand that. Something that is important though is the enzyme ATPase, which is sometimes called ATP synthase. It's the same enzyme, and that catalyzes building up and breaking ATP. Okay, so just to summarize that, ATP has got a lot of energy, and that can be turned into ADP, which holds and inorganic phosphate, PI, which holds less energy, and that allows some of that energy to be given out and taken up by other things. ATP is a way of storing chemical energy, and it's a much smaller packet of energy than, for example, a glucose molecule. So one glucose molecule can be turned into about 34 ATP molecules worth of energy. So it makes it a more useful currency. It's a bit like you going to a shop with a £1,000 note, if there was such a thing. There isn't. But it would be very difficult for you to do your shopping with a £1,000 note. It would make more sense to turn it into £10 notes, and then you can go, which are more useful. So ATP is like the £10 note to glucose's £1,000 note. Just makes it far more flexible for the cell processes. Right. That is all I wanted to cover today. Does anybody have any questions on that? Next week, I want to actually go into the nitty-gritty of photosynthesis, and I was thinking about having 2 lessons next week because I want to break it into 2 halves. Is that okay with people? I'm not asking you to do a lot of written work on this, actually. I'm going to just stop recording now. There we go. Stop recording.